an hour. As just flashed across the screen, the meeting is being recorded. Though no voices other than the speakers will be identified as we're asking people to put their questions in the chat box, which we'll do at the end of the meeting. So let me formally begin. I did want to give a warm welcome to this BMRC webinar, Resilience and Refuge. My name is John Shields, and I'm a professor at Ryerson University, or if you prefer, X University. And I send greetings from the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities SSHRC Research Partnership, led by Valerie Preston at York University. Because this is a webinar and we're coming from many different locations, I did want to extend a broad land acknowledgement to the Indigenous nations and people who have and continue to occupy these lands we speak from, and who have nurtured and protected and continue to nurture and protect that land, act and live in a relationship of friendship and peace. I also wish to acknowledge, especially given recent events, the challenges we continue to confront with respect to racism, intolerance, and racially and ethnically motivated violence, and struggle. And so the struggle to achieve a truly inclusive and just society is ever more important. Now, we have a very full agenda today with 4 presentations, and each of the presentations is going to be allotted 12 minutes, and I'm going to try to be very strict with that time frame. And so I'll give everybody a 2-minute warning once you've done the 10 minutes, just so you have a heads up that it's coming to an end. And it's only at the end of the session that we will do an open Q&A session. So for those of you in the audience, if you could please use the chat box to ask your questions, and I'll try to collect them along the way and present them at the end. Now I'm going to introduce each of the speakers just very briefly, and I'm going to just introduce them as they're about to speak, just to save a bit of time. And the first actually set of speakers for the first talk is Nicole Ives, who's an associate professor in the School of Social Work at McGill University and co-founder of Indigenous Access at McGill, and Jill Hanley, who's a professor at the McGill School of Social Work and scientific director of Sherpa University Institute for Applied Research on Health, Immigration, and Diversity. And they're going to be presenting a paper today on faith-based organizations and support of refugee claims and community resilience in Montreal. So take it away.
Thank you very much, John. We are doing a classic last-minute switch of topics. I'm sorry, we sent the information, but maybe not to all the places to get it across. But we are actually presenting on asylum seekers in Quebec and language issues, including their access to what we call in Quebec francisation, Francization. As an aspect that's really fundamental to people's settlement experience, their ability to be resilient and be welcomed. Language proficiency in an official language, and in Quebec, particularly French, is really fundamental to short-term and long-term settlement goals for asylum seekers. And being proficient in the official language is really critical to labor market integration, access to, in terms of using and information about health and social services, development of social capital, meaning friendships, connections for work, connections for education, for information, and just a sense of belonging and connection to the broader society. And it also can make a big difference in terms of people's sense of loneliness or isolation if they're not able to speak with other members of the community. So this is one of the things that's been really important to our project. So we're coming at this using the holistic integration model in order to analyze our data related to integration outcomes. And what's really important to us is integration is complex, and it's a pathway through social, subjective, and interactional integration that takes into account social identity, personal history, and socioeconomic context. So what's really important here is that individuals who migrate are only one piece of their ability to integrate, or their experiences integrating. There are critical structural factors that affect how much people can achieve, or what their options are when they come to Canada. So we're looking at it from both the individual point of view and the structural point of view. And we're drawing on data from a project that was multi-method. It was a project that involved several members of BMRC, so Nicole and I, but also Frédéric Dejean, who's presenting today, was a member of this project, Damaris Rose. And it was a Action Collective project that allowed us to receive funding for an independent project that was then taken up by the Ministry of Immigration and other provincial ministries to inform their policy. We've just submitted the report on Friday. It had multiple data sources, so secondary data, quantitative data from IRCC. MTRSS is the Quebec Ministry of Labor and Social Solidarity, so welfare, and the Immigration and Refugee Board. The core of it, and what we're going to talk about a lot today, was a structured questionnaire with 324 asylum seekers that you can see the criteria there. We were reaching out to people who came to Quebec between January 1st, 2017 and December 31st, 2018. The government was very interested in the uptick of people that were crossing irregularly, mostly at Roxham Road in Quebec. So this is tens of thousands of people, much more than in the recent past. And we had a multilingual team that was able to do these questionnaires in the 6 languages you see below. After the survey, we did interviews with 31 of the people. Oops, I have 31, and we also did focus groups that involved 49 community workers from different types of sectors. So very large. So I'm just going to bring these all up so we don't. So basically, in terms of our book chapter, we're going to present today some aspects of it. So a portrait of the sample in terms of their language skills and ability, the impacts of language that they're reporting on their settlement process, and then talk a little bit about the Quebec policies that shape francisation. So to begin with, it's interesting to see that at the arrival or very soon after, we do have nearly 30% of people who speak French already, but another 40% who speak neither English or French, and 30% who speak only English or another language. So this is like at the crux of the concern in Quebec. If you're from outside Quebec, you might not be fully aware of all the politics that goes into this, but it's a very big political issue in Quebec that newcomers integrate into Francophone society. So we're not going to get into all the historical reasons for this great concern, but it's an important consideration in Quebec. And for the most part, Quebec has responded by making widely available French courses to newcomers. So you can see here that there are 70% of the asylum seekers who arrived in that time who did not speak French at all upon arrival. And so they would be important targets for francisation, although as asylum seekers, a little less so than permanent immigrants, because of the uncertainty about whether or not they're going to remain in Canada or Quebec. So in terms of their sense of proficiency, this includes people who would have taken some French courses after arriving. And you can see that many people consider themselves to be able to communicate at a basic or quite good level of French. So only 40% that still say after 3 or more months in Quebec that they have poor to no French capacity. And we can see that the people are reporting slightly better English capacity. And so only 24% of the people who responded said they had no capacity at all in English. So you can see that among the asylum seekers who came in that time period, that English was a stronger language in terms of their capacity. However, the language came out in our survey as one of the biggest challenges in their settlement process. So our community stakeholders were talking about how access to information when people first arrived, in terms of how does the housing market work? How do I access healthcare? How do I get my kids in school? What schools can my kids go to? This was all, it's a challenge already for people who speak some English, but people who don't speak either English or French really have a very difficult time getting access to this information. And it's an important role of the community stakeholders, the community settlement workers and community groups to help people who don't speak English or French, and even those who just speak English, to access information. We can see, however, that people show a lot of resilience in terms of getting access to information and services in the absence of strong French. So you see 31% were just saying they would do their best to communicate with like hand signals and using what words they knew. They would just try and make it work, drawing, stuff like that. Google Translate, people are turning increasingly to technology to help them communicate when they're face-to-face with someone, or if they're receiving written documents. We have 23% that are asking friends or family to translate. And only 12% were saying that they were able to communicate through an interpreter. So even though this is supposed to be widely available in the health and social service sector, for example, we see not a lot of people are able to actually benefit from this. Nicola, I'm losing track of how many slides I'm supposed to do now because I can't see the number of slides.
It's okay. It's okay. I can take over.
Okay.
Thank you. So our focus on language and specifically francisation, in terms of the findings, the francisation program is run by the Ministry of Immigration, Francisation and Integration. The acronym is MIFI, and it has two components. One is to cover the language skills that are used in various settings, whether it's vocational or technical, in addition to specific learning contexts, as well as the grammar elements, pronunciation, spelling. But it's designed to enable immigrants to fully participate in French civic and cultural life. So that covers the language. The second piece is that it introduces what the government of Quebec has termed sociocultural norms and shared democratic values. And so that's another piece that's very Quebec specific. So in addition to the language, there's a cultural piece regarding the shared democratic values, which is different from the other provinces and territories who have a more generic language program and cultural introduction program from IRCC. So what we found was that asylum seekers had access to full-time and part-time courses. There are no fees required. However, if they go part-time, there's no access to financial support in terms of participation in the courses and also childcare costs. So that means that if they need to work and then participate part-time in order to further their job prospects down the road, they are unable to do so.
2-minute warning.
Sorry, 2-minute warning. Okay. Next slide, Jill. So some obstacles to francisation. Let me just, so you could see that there was a majority of non-Francophone respondents who participated in the francisation courses, although you had over a quarter who would have liked to have taken them but were unable to. And the reasons that they were unable to were related to the barriers below, such as lack of access to subsidized childcare, the need to be home to take care of children. Some parents worked around that by having one parent participate during the day in one session and then switching off. But other barriers where the schedule wasn't convenient, and that there might not be any places in their neighborhood. Next slide.
So in terms of discussion, I mean, one point is that asylum seekers are demonstrating an openness and willingness to learn French. There's a very high interest in taking the courses, and they're showing a lot of resilience in terms of learning a new language, communicating across barriers. We're raising a sort of current affairs concern, actually, that the Quebec government has proposed Bill 96, which suggests that newcomers to Quebec will no longer be able to communicate with the government in any language besides French once they've been in the province for 6 months, meaning after that, all communication with the government will have to be in French. However, we know, as we saw in what Nicole said, that there's many barriers to their participation in French courses, and there's a concern about using punitive, exclusionary incentives to learn French as opposed to more welcoming, inclusive ones.
Maybe just a few moments, just to
So in summary, our recommendations are for the part-time francisation courses that those who are enrolled have the same types of benefits as those who are enrolled full-time. Also to facilitate access to interpretation throughout the healthcare and social services network. That is a key piece to be able to access and trust service providers. Along with that is encouraging the hiring of multilingual staff, again, to build the trust in creating comfort for people to access services, and looking more holistically at integration to foster the resilience that asylum seekers have shown and encourage integration.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to go on to our next speaker. That's Annick Dauphin, who's the Associate Professor in Social Sciences at the University de Quebec at Ottawa. And she will present a paper on intersecting perspectives of stakeholders and refugees on the settlement of Syrian refugees in Gatineau, Quebec. And I just want to remind the audience once again that you can use the chat to pose any questions that you might have. Take it away, Annick.
Thank you very much. It's Université du Québec en Outaouais, not in Ottawa. No problem.
Thank you.
So, hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share with you some of the elements of the collaborative study I conducted on the resettlement of Syrian refugees in the city of Gatineau in Outaouais in Quebec. The main stakeholders involved in the resettlement of refugees in Gatineau participated in this research through an advisory committee. Gatineau is one of the 14 cities designated by the government of Quebec to welcome refugees. It therefore participated in the Syrian Refugee Resettlement Initiative launched by the federal government in November 2015. And in the 2 following years, it hosted more than 400 refugees, of whom around 2/3 were supported by the state and the other third by the community. The objectives of the study were to take stock of their resettlement, to shed light on the local factors that have contributed to, but also limited, the overall resilience of the refugees in the context of Gatineau, and to make recommendations to improve services. During the conduct of the survey, a small number of divergent views among the stakeholders emerge. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. I also, like Jill, made a slight change on for my presentation today. And for those who would like to know the result of the research report, it will be available very soon. My aim today was to provide an opportunity to the divergent point of views to express themselves more freely and to dialogue with each other. And I would like to point out that the document on which I am relying today is only a draft, and that I am awaiting feedback and validation from my co-authors. It is therefore under all reserve that I make this presentation by emphasizing very strongly that it is about my understanding as of today. So if some of my co-authors are here today, please feel free to jump in and to correct my interpretation or to add some information. The dissensus mainly concerns the right way to do resettlement. The right way in the sense of that which will promote the resilience and integration of refugees and the resilience of those accompanying them. They revolve around three questions: the place of volunteers in the infrastructure of resettlement services. Second, the municipal government support for monoethnic ethnocultural groups. And third, the approach for supporting the state-sponsored refugees. So let's start with the first dissensus. So volunteers outside the sponsorship group numbered in the hundreds during the first wave of Syrian refugees arriving in Gatineau. The service provider designated by the government to support refugees was literally overwhelmed by the amount of volunteers that were seeking to help. And seeing that the organization of volunteers was insufficient and wishing to better control their operations, some volunteers then decided to regroup and work independently of service provider. For example, like the picture you can see on the slide, they distributed used bicycle, repaired used bicycle, tablet, and computers to family. And probably more importantly, they offered support for francization at home, focusing on daily life. One of the challenges that these independent volunteer groups faced was making their existence known to refugees. The reason was that the service provider would not agree to provide the contact details of the volunteers to the refugees, or the other way around. Volunteers therefore had to rely on word of mouth between refugees to make themselves known. And this had the consequences of increasing their workload and of missing families that were not in their network. For the service provider, the groups of independent volunteers were not legitimate since they had no official status, and it could not be sure that the volunteers were trustworthy and had the human skills required. So for these reasons, And since the service provider had its own volunteer, it was undesirable from his point of view to formally inform the refugees of the existence of these group of independent volunteers. These tensions raise the question of how to establish the legitimacy of these initiatives without dampening their momentum as the that without that I'm sorry that they clearly contribute to building the resilience of refugees, especially when a massive influx of refugees provoke a great mobilization. As support groups are often born spontaneously and have a fleeting life, it is unrealistic to require them to form a nonprofit organization before starting their activities. The second dissensus concerns the municipal government support for ethno-cultural groups that are monoethnic. As you know, municipal government, even in small and medium cities like Gatineau, are increasingly called upon to act on inclusion. And during the Syrian refugee resettlement initiatives, the city of Gatineau played an active role. In fact, it was more active than it ever had in welcoming refugees. The city was a member of the reception committee created, which brought together all the frontline actors involved in resettlement. It played a role of coordination and liaison between the stakeholders. Among other things, it oversaw public communication relating to the arrival of refugees' families in Gatineau and ensured that the message and information were sent to citizens. It also supported the frontline actors in their preparation and in their activities, and it organized complementary activities to theirs. For example, the city organized 2 days of collecting material donation, which helped channel the energy and enthusiasm of many citizens who wanted to contribute. Some citizens, however, wanted the city to be more proactive in organizing cultural rapprochement activities for Syrian refugees, and if not possible, to at least support the volunteers who were willing to do so, either financially or materially. But the city refused to support this type of activities because it has for policy to finance only activities that are aimed at all ethnic group or bigger ethnic group, not just one group such as the Syrian, as it was the case here. The question of whether city should support the funding of a monoethnic cultural association is not new, and it also goes beyond the municipal framework. And at the heart of the hesitation is often the fear of discrimination and of favoring identity withdrawal. But this position can also be problematic when certain groups of immigrants have certain needs, and that activities dedicated to these needs could promote their resilience. The last dissensus that I want to touch on concerns the approach for supporting the state-sponsored refugees. The service provider designated by the government in Gatineau has a 40-year track record. And at the heart of its philosophy is the idea that integration is a two-way street. On the one hand, the host society must ensure that it offers newcomers an inclusive and caring environment in which they can access various resources and services. On the other hand, newcomers must take the reins of their integration and invest in their establishment by taking advantage of the multiple resources and services made available to them. Although there is 2 minutes,
yeah.
Although there is a broad consensus on this perspective in academia and practice, its operationalization may be subject to debate. For the service provider, it was important to show the refugees how to do things by themselves so that they could stand on their own feet at the end of the sponsorship period. Other actors felt, however, that the refugees had to fend for themselves too much, and several refugees shared this view and said that they felt left on their own too soon. One of the risks of accompanying refugees too closely is that they do not develop that independence that we want them to have. One of the risks of striving for independence early on is that refugee may then turn to other resources, family, friends, community, that may not be able to support them well. In other words, the risk is that refugee remains dependent, but of someone else, who is less competent at resettlement. So we must therefore find the right balance and the right strategy to develop autonomy. So I will stop here and I will be happy to answer your questions later on.
Thank you so much, Annick. We'll go on to our next presentation now. And I want to bring on Frédéric Desjean, who's a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the Université de Québec et Montréal. And he'll be presenting a paper, as I understand, on the Haitian evangelical churches in Montreal with respect to resilience and asylum seekers. Take it away. You're on mute, Frédéric.
Now you hear me, I think. Okay, sorry. Excuse me. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. The title of my presentation is Coping with the Experience of Displacement, the Role of Christian Churches with Haitian Asylum Seekers in Montreal. And we will see that the notion of coping and religious coping is very important for the chapter we will submit very soon. So just to introduce, wait, it's not, okay. So in 2017, the Quebec discovered the realities of many asylum seekers who crossed the border between the US and the Canada at La Colle, not far from Montreal. During the summer of 2017, the city of Montreal turned the Olympic Stadium into a welcome center for asylum seekers. And such a picture you can see on the PowerPoint, because it was like an iconic picture, a symbol traveled all around the world. The same year, more than 7,300 Haitian people crossed the border, and they constituted more than 30% of the whole asylum seekers entering Canada. Nevertheless, 1 year after, in 2018, Haitian citizens represented the minority of asylum seekers entering Canada. My presentation is about the story of these people who arrived in Canada, most of them having been through very hard times. It is about welcome and hospitality. More precisely, it is about the role of Christian churches, most of them evangelical, in the process of integration and inclusion in the Quebecer society. The research is based on interviews with 10 pastors or 10 religious leaders, because they were not only pastors, 9 evangelical pastors in evangelical churches, and 1 Catholic. Because maybe you know, but in Montreal there is an Haitian Catholic mission, Notre Dame d'Haïti. And we conducted as well 20 interviews with asylum seekers. And most of these interviews were conducted in Creole. So because I cannot speak Creole, I worked with a sociologist who was a postdoc fellow with me a few years ago, Emerson Jean-Baptiste. So for my presentation, I don't want to spend too much time on the context of intervention of the churches. So I just want to give you few elements about the context in Montreal. Probably you know that Montreal is the 3rd biggest Asian diaspora in the world, right after Miami and New York. The presence of Asian in Quebec goes back to the 1960s. There was a second wave in the 70s and a third wave in the 90s. In 2011, more than 120,000 people had an Asian origin. And it is important to precise that most of these people lived in the Montreal area, either in the city of Montreal or in the suburbs of Montreal. In the majority, Haitian people are Catholic, but 40% of them are evangelicals. In Montreal, in my own research on evangelicals, I estimate that there are about 150 Haitian evangelical churches. Just to give you an idea, in the borough of Montreal Nord, which is in the north of Montreal, there are about between 40 and 45 Haitian churches. So it's very important in Montreal. Just a few words about the trajectories of asylum seekers in Quebec. For the research, we found out three main categories of asylum seekers: those who had chosen Canada and directly arrived from Haiti, those who lived in the US after the earthquake of 2010 and then had to leave the US, and finally, a third category, those who spend years in South America, especially in Brazil, and travel to Canada in very precarious conditions. Now, the field of intervention of the churches in 2017. We conducted 10 interviews with religious leaders, and all the religious leaders told that their churches had been involved with asylum seekers. And some of them precise that they directly went to the Olympic Stadium to get into contact with the asylum seekers. So the churches were really key actors in 2017 with the asylum seekers crisis in Quebec. We can sum up the intervention and the importance of churches with the formula of the 3R: refugee, respectability, and resources. Refugee is linked to the feeling of loss of social ties, and loss of cultural landmarks. Asylum seekers have to deal with this situation. And regarding to this feeling, evangelical churches are like safe spaces for where asylum seekers found cultural landmarks, even if they were not much involved in churches in their country of origin. The second R, respectability, is linked to the recognition asylum seekers are looking for. This recognition is the feeling that their life has a value. In churches, they are considered as brothers and sisters in Christ, and in the eyes of God, each human life has the same importance and the same value. And this value and this importance has a sharp contrast with their everyday life experience because of their administrative status, where they have the feeling that they are less important than other people. And finally, the last R, resources refers to the materials and immaterials that asylum seekers were provided with by churches. I directly go to the third section. If you want to learn more, you will have to read the chapter. The third section, the churches as protection factors. As you probably know, the word resilience is today a buzzword. First used in psychology, it is now widely used by the social sciences. Psychologists define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity. In a book titled Psychologie de la résilience, the French psychologist Marie Anneau adds something very important for our discussion. She defines résilience as l'art de s'adapter aux situations adverses en montrant des capacités qui mettent en jeu des ressources internes et externes. So, what is important in this quotation is that resilience is not only about a person. Resilience is a process involving a person and an environment. Resilience works when there are factors of protection which are both linked to the person and linked to the environment. For instance, the family, community organizations, or religious institutions. And there is a second notion which is important for our discussion. This is a notion of coping. Coping is close to resilience, but it's not exactly the same thing. Some authors in psychology speak about religious coping, and religious coping is a religiously framed cognitive, emotional, or behavioral responses to stress, encompassing multiple methods and purposes, as well as positive and negative dimensions.
2-minute warning.
Yep. So just to finish with the idea of in the chapter we try to address the issue of churches as spaces of resilience. Regarding the notion of resilience or religious coping, it is important to consider two levels. The first level is a sociological level. In the wake of sociology of networks, one can consider churches as organizations whose one of the most important aspects is the production of social ties. And for instance, the German sociologist Georg Simmel wrote, the faith which has come to be regarded as the essential, the substance of religion, is first a relation between individuals. Other authors contend that social ties in religious organizations draws on trust and trustworthiness. For instance, Robert Putnam contends that trustworthiness lubricates social life. It was clear from the interviews that many asylum seekers develop social ties based on trust in the churches. And there are social ties with the church members who sometimes share the same experience of displacement and immigration, and there are social ties with pastors. Just to conclude, a few words about the second aspect we try to address in the chapter. This is the question of how asylum seekers use religion as a frame to tell and give a meaning to their experience. Religion provides them with the necessary words to tell a story which often is full of traumas. In a research with Muslims Kosovars, Godiak explained that the Kosovars conceptualized their suffering as a spiritual experience and turned to Islam to recover from war trauma. We could say exactly the same thing with the Haitian asylum seekers. Thank you. I will just
Thank you, Patrick. That's great. So our last speaker, let me introduce, is Mireille Paquette, and she's an associate professor of political science and the research chair on the new politics of immigration at Concordia University, and she's going to be presenting a paper about sanctuary cities in Canada. All right.
Thank you everyone for being here. It's really great to be able to present results, even if it would be much better if we were all together in person. So I'm just gonna start this. Can you all see my slides? It's all good? So this project is entirely funded by the MRC, and I want to echo my thanks to Valerie and to the partnership for making this research possible. It's a research project that I directed in collaboration with John, who's here, as well as my colleague Megan Joy, Idil Atak from Ryerson University, and Graham Edson from Ryerson University. So the project focuses on understanding the impact and the experiences of immigrant serving agencies when it comes to municipal sanctuaries or access without fear policies in Canada. What are those policies, in case you don't know? So they target primarily immigrants without status or living with precarious status. It's cities. In Canada, so far, we have 7 sanctuary cities, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Hamilton, Edmonton, London, and Ajax. And in a forthcoming paper, my colleague Megan Joy and I talk about how in Canada it would make more sense to talk about localist access policies as opposed to using the language of sanctuary cities, because ultimately what those policies do, with some notable exceptions, is mostly to provide access to services and provide information, but does not necessarily entail the provision of new forms of ID, though there are some experiences in Montreal, or fund services for non-status migrants. And they also, which is a core difference, have no impact on how police in cities actually interact with non-status migrants, as well as whether they collaborate with enforcement agencies. So this is our starting point, but the project was mainly focused on understanding how the agencies that serve immigrants understand the need of the populations that are targeted by these policies, whether they think that these policies actually have an impact for immigrants living without status, and what are the views, or what would be the preferences of these agencies for new or changing municipal policies. And this decision to focus on agencies is important for 2 reasons. First, because we consider them as proxies for these populations, non-status or precarious, or migrants with precarious status. It is much safer and easier to reach the organization, though it comes with bias, obviously, but we still decided it's better. But also because ultimately, and John has, I think, described it quite well in his work, because they are the street level bureaucrats of immigrant integration policies. And Annie just talked about it as well, right? So they are the one delivering the programs and interacting on a daily basis with immigrants through their integration process, but also when they have to negotiate status. So we decided to focus on them. Sorry. Okay, so what did we do? So we conducted a national survey of immigrant serving agencies or nonprofits. Is somebody sending me a message? No? Okay, sorry. And we did it between 2018 and 2020. It took longer to collect data than we expected. It also took longer for us to get to our sampling frame, and we can get to that in the Q&A. And so what we did is actually acquire a list of all the immigrant service agencies in the country from IRCCs, as well as from the Quebec Government of Canada. And it allowed us to actually have their email and be able to send them a list of questions to be filled regarding our research topic. Obviously, this is not a probability sample, and there are a lot of things we can do in terms of kind of doing regressions or extending the generalization of our result. But still, it's looking at how organizational research is done. This is a pretty good method, and we were able to get over 300 responses from multiple cities in every provinces and territory of Canada. And this brought us to about 48% response rate for agencies that receive either provincial funding or federal funding to provide services for immigrants. And so what did we do? We asked them questions about their experience in service non-status migrant, their experiences with the policies, and what they would like to see in the future. So the first, I think, result, what we show basically in the chapter and what we show in the study in general is that indeed, there is a need, and I think that if you've been working on with actors on the ground, you know this, but it's nice to have some kind of quantification of it. It is helpful. So 76% of the agencies that we have surveys have talked about receiving. Receiving requests from immigrants without status to receive service. I'm sorry, there is a typo. And 76% of them also tell us that when meeting immigrants, they ask them about their immigration status before providing them with services. So they cited two reasons to do that. The main reason was that they had to do it because of IRCC. And I mean, we have so many quotes in the survey. It's like, well, our funder demands to know whether the person is a PR, whether the person is a refugee or an asylum seeker. But a good number as well of respondents talked about the need to ask for status to plan better their interventions. So for a lot of them, the question wasn't about whether they were eligible for services, but it was more about to understand the kind of services they needed. Organization surveyed talked about receiving between 1 to 20 requests from immigrant living without status a month. I'm still doing some work trying to actually, make some kind of sense with the data to know how's the relation between organizational size. But the point is that these are seen as constant, not always super pressing, and it would vary from cities to city. The most requested services from these population are recommendation for legal advice, assistance with status, information about resources and referral, health services, and employment services. And we don't have a base to compare with the general population or the PR population, but we do know that recommendation for legal advice really came at the top of the list. And only 21% of the agencies that we have that has answered the survey talk about having access to some funding to serve these populations. So the reality is that none of the organizations we survey say they would not provide services to non-status migrants to the best of their capacities. But, and I have some quotes here, the first one really kind of like sums up what we found is that, you know, this is volunteer work, we are not paid to do it, we will do it the best that we can. Another case that we saw was, and that's the second quote, is organizations that have a charitable status or that have access to other forms of funding that aren't either associated with the federal immigration programs or that are or that comes from private sources. They usually are able to fund services for these populations much more easily. So the results here are pretty simple. So there is a constant demand for such service. Those services aren't funded. And the services mostly have to do, the needs mostly have to do with all the services, but help with legal issues and status are really important. Now we move to the second part, or the second question of this project, which is, does it make a difference, right? Like, what about like the organizations that live in municipal sanctuary or sanctuary cities, or in cities that have access without fear policies? Does it actually make a difference in the lives of their clients? Here again, right, this is kind of two steps. So we can talk to people living in those cities, but we did find some interesting but not surprising results. So please excuse the worst slide ever. Okay, I just wanted to show quickly a little bit. So one of the things we did is that we asked providers about we asked providers, based on your client's experience, how often do the following municipal services inquire about immigration service, about immigration status before providing services? And so we ask about tons of stuff that can be tons of municipal services. And I don't have here in the same slide the results in non-sanctuary cities, but I can just point to a couple of them, right? So for example, they say that bylaw officers in sanctuary cities still continue to ask almost always about immigration status. This is also the case for non-sanctuary cities, but the result is even higher, right? So there's a much higher rate of requesting immigration status. Another interesting finding is we asked about emergency services, so first responders, firefighters, ambulance, and all of that. So you can see that in the sanctuary cities here, if you can see it, I should have a pointer, but I don't. The always is not as much as the rarely, though in non-sanctuary city, about 64% of the organization reported that first responders or emergency services asked about immigration status about 64% of the time. So it seems to be a decrease. In terms of police, you can see that the occasionally and always is pretty high, and it is lower than in non-sanctuary cities, but remain probably like the difference wouldn't be significant if we could actually test it for it. And in terms of the transit system, things, yeah, 2 minutes. Yeah, in terms of the transit systems, it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. So we still have to dig into those results to make them nicer. But what I can tell you is that the differences don't seem so big in most of the cases. We also asked them about the experience of their client in terms of feelings. And so two things here, we have a big battery of questions. I'm just going to talk about two things that are interesting. So we asked them about their feelings of the overall feelings of fear of their clients. And here you can see that for a lot of the respondents living in sanctuary cities, it seems like not a lot has changed, right? So the enactment of a sanctuary city policy doesn't seem to have decreased the feeling of fear over deportation or loss of status. But interestingly enough, it seems to have changed something about their feeling of safety in the city, right? And how like respondent might feel better living in the city, interacting with local services, though we still have to look a little more about those results. Are there some preferences? In light of those lukewarm results, what was really interesting when we asked more about the preferences to agencies, a lot of them were actually kind of, they were like, they were generally okay with it, right? So they were okay with continuing to have a formal policy. They were okay, and they actually wanted to have more policy work and more reflection when it comes to thinking about moving to new support for non-status population. And they also expressed a desire to see municipal government become more active in the provision of housing and access to health for these population. But then again, right, also recognizing a lot of these things aren't city jurisdiction. And I'm just going to end here with those quotes from the survey. So, the first quote is something that we found really often coming in comments, which was like, you know what, like, let's just not get the city involved. It's just none of their business. So keep the municipality out of things. A second respondent saying, healthcare and motor vehicle licensing would be number one, and that is provincial jurisdiction. So there seems also to be a clear kind of like, consciousness rising or pre-existing consciousness about who is responsible for what. And one of my favorite quotes in the survey, which is like, the moral of this experience is that only agencies can be the best to carry, to protect or carry or to support non-status populations. Agency need the funding, and agency will be the best actor to bring services directly to non-status populations. So, the situation is complicated. We know it was, but agencies are totally experiencing this mixed feeling, let's say, in relation to that. So the future analysis will have to look more in details about differences across regions of Canada, but we might need to do another wave of the survey to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I want to, first of all, thank all of the speakers for really interesting and great presentations. I wish we had a lot more time. We're actually at the end of our time, but maybe if I could indulge the audience that would wish to stay a little bit longer, maybe I could just pose one question to everyone. And maybe just get a short sort of response from each of you on that. And I just wonder if each of you could briefly speak to the main value and advantages you see in a social, with a social resilience framework for your work and for understanding the results of your work. So anybody want to volunteer to go first on that?
I mean, I can, John, since I'm like not recovered. I'm not so I didn't have the time to talk about that last slide where I talked a little bit about that. So obviously something needs to happen at the local level to ensure resilience. But what I found really, there are two angles to resilience that I think are relevant for this work. One of them is the resiliency of these policies, right? And thinking about who decides that these policies are going to be developed, and then like, are they actually funded, and are they actually supported, and can they actually build the kind of local support and stakeholder support to make them a reality. So that's, well, that would be the only thing, actually. The second thing, it's too complicated for nothing. But for us, it really was that, right? Like, it was like, so there's the individuals and the migrant itself, but there's also the resiliency of social structures, which, innovation is great. But you need to also think about, resistance and capacity to endure and to build.
Yes, thank you. Any other comments? Jill, was that your hand up there?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this I think was echoed in all the presentation, that I think we're wanting to look at resilience as something that is shaped a lot by structural factors, that if we want to understand individuals' capacity to adapt and integrate when they arrive in the new context, we really need to understand the contextual factors that make that easier or harder for people to do. So this social resiliency, if we're talking about people's place within society and within social policies. If we're talking about language learning and language capacity, it's absolutely essential. We can see that people want to, in our study, they want to learn French. They're taking action to learn French. They're trying to muddle through services. But if we have policies that make people feel excluded and punished, if their French is not good enough, then what impact is that going to have in the long run?
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Anik or Frederic or Nicole?
Maybe I can add that I think social resilience is not only about all the structures and the policies, but also I think about the people, the human resources, the workers in the agency. I think they are making a huge difference in building the resilience of the people.
Yes, good point. Nicole or Frederic, anything to add there?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because the issue of social resilience is very at the core of the chapter we are finishing currently. And talking about the role of churches with asylum seekers, there are different levels of resilience. We can talk of spiritual resilience, but the social resilience is important. And we know that a lot of the research on the topic of role of religious organization with immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, they emphasize the material support, but sometimes they forget the social aspect of the resilience, especially because it's probably harder to assess, because it's easy to assess when a church is giving some money or helping to find an apartment, but it's harder to assess how they try to help people getting social ties. And this aspect is very important for us and for the chapter.
Yes. Any other, Nicole? Yeah.
So I was just going to add to from what Jill was saying, that looking at the resilience of asylum seekers and working with that instead of against it is critical. And it seems that particularly from language policy in Quebec, that they may be moving towards a more punitive and exclusionary approach to integration rather than fostering resilience, harnessing resilience. If you want to look at it from a more, a selfish, political strategy way, they're still working to the wrong end.
Thank you. Great perspectives there. I am conscious of the time. We are over. So if there's no further comments, I wanted to thank all of the speakers. We will be posting this on the BMRC website a little bit later, so that those who weren't able to attend today, and I know we had a ton of interest in this session, will have access to this. And I look forward to going back and revisiting this session myself in the very near future. So thank you all to all of the speakers, and thank you for the audience for attending today. And this is the last of the webinars for this term. We will be back in September, and we're planning 3 additional webinars at that time. So stay tuned. More information will be coming towards the end of the summer, I think, with regard to that. So once again, thanks everyone, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Enjoy the summer.
Yes, I think we all need a break now.
Sorry, I was just wondering if the recording will be available on the website. Yes. Okay, because I have not seen the recording of the previous webinar, or are they there?
Some of them are there.
Slides.
Yeah,
okay.
No, some of them are there. Have a look. And they are,
Yeah.
we're trying to get them into 2 forms. One, the whole thing for people who have more than an hour to watch, and also to just pull out individual presentations for people like me who have limited attention spans.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
But
Have a nice
no,
summer.
they're great. I'm so looking forward to reading these chapters.
Yeah, really, really great stuff.
Yeah, Mireille.
How late can I send my chapter?
This is a negotiation, my dear. Send me an email.
Yeah.
Send John and me an email.
We
Nice.
can-
Okay. Well, technically, John is in trouble, right? Because like he's a
That's right.
co-author, so
I'm
he
all-
has to like. Okay, all right.
This is so interesting.
It
Yannick, it is fascinating. Because, you know, the studies that Damaris did with housing,
Yeah.
one of the agency comments was how to deal with volunteers. And you have really taken that apart. It's fabulous.
And it's great to have a lot of new data sources,
Yeah.
to pull upon.
Mm.
It's really, really rich stuff.
And so